Now, once independence was declared in July 1776, it's plainly obvious that this newly formed republic had to deal with two formidable problems. And the first one was war against Great Britain. That's a given because, of course, the English Empire is not going to let the colonials just cut off their relations without military conflict. So there was this necessity to defend themselves against the English military effort. Now, let's recall, however, that there's no standing army at this time, let alone a navy. And on the other hand, the English Empire possessed the most powerful navy in the world. Of course, they have their professional army. It's arguable that they're the most powerful empire in the entire world at that time. So, on paper, so to say, the colonials weren't supposed to win this war. And if it wasn't for the intervention of France towards the end of the war, that could have been likely the case, despite the heroism and courage displayed by the colonials engaged in the fight. Okay, but the other necessity was to create a central government because, as we know, this is not going to be 13 separate nation states. This is the United States of America. And if they're all going to be united as one single country, you need to form a government. And that's a central government, obviously, that unites all the different states together, the 13 states. But note the irony as stated in the slide. The whole reason for declaring independence in the first place, let alone the prior conflict with the former mother country of England, was around the issue of a powerful central government that was trying to impose their authority and their will uh, upon the colonialists, at least from the colonial perspective. Now, let's remember that the English perspective as well is a pragmatic, a practical, that is to say, situation. We need to raise taxes because our imperial coffers had run dry. Right, we're nearing bankruptcy. Again, the irony is clear. You need to create a new government, but you're fearful of a central government. Okay, so what happened, therefore, is the formation of our first government, and this is our first constitution. Many Americans don't actually know this, that we had our first constitution that basically failed, and it was replaced by another constitution in 1789, and that is our current constitution. In other words, many Americans assume that our current constitution is the one and only constitution we've had in our history, but that's not the case. We had something called the Articles of Confederation that was ratified in 1781 and lasted until 1787. Now, notice we declared independence in 1776, so there's a 5 year period between 1776 and 1781 where there is no actual central government, and this is the period when we are waging war with Great Britain. And we're also engaged in debates, right, as to how to design this new government. And it took that long to iron out the differences and to come to an agreement. So this is our first government again, our first constitution. Now, it shouldn't surprise us of this fact. The framers of the Constitution, the architects involved in designing this new government, made sure that it was as decentralized as possible. Okay, yeah, it's a central government, but they want to make it not a powerful central government. They want to resemble almost this decentralized, right, with minimal authority conferred upon this new government. So when we examine the particular features that characterize the articles, we see that it is indeed that minimal power that's again conferred upon this government. The first feature here is that the state is sovereign. All right, now let's remember we had 13 colonies. They become states now, 13 states, and they write out those imperial laws, and out of their laws, they become state laws. Right now, those political institutions within those states, whether it's a legislative or political institutions within that state, they are sovereign over that of federal law. Okay, so now this is in many ways different from today because we're aware that there are two systems, the state governments and the federal government that we have today. And most people associate the federal government as having this overriding power over state governments, right? So that basically indicates that our federal government is more sovereign, arguably speaking, than state governments. But again, it's a checks and balances between state and federal. But certainly in this period between 1781 and 87, we see the state as more sovereign. And again, this doesn't surprise us because that keeps it decentralized. Now, feature B here, no executive. That is to say, no president. Hopefully you could see why they were distrustful towards an executive position within the government. Well, basically what they feared was this executive would be conferred with so much power that it would begin to resemble a monarch. And, you know, the Americans did not want a monarch. So, therefore, no executive with our first government. Nor is there a judicial branch at the federal level. Okay, so we know that's not true today. We have an executive as well as judicial branch, and it's called the Supreme Court, of course. And even today, when we think of the Supreme Court, we recognize that in terms of power, our Supreme Court reigns supreme, right, as a legal institution in our country. In other words, they have this power known as, quote, judicial review, unquote, which we'll discuss later in a different lecture. But judicial review is the authority of the Supreme Court to decide upon the constitutionality of any law in our country, whether it's a federal law or a state law. All right. So in other words, it ends with what the Supreme Court says. You can't go any further than the Supreme Court. Well, back then, there's not even a Supreme Court with the Articles of Confederation, right? So what does that mean? It means that, it's the local courts that reign, that are more sovereign. So again, it doesn't surprise us that they would prefer it that way. Now, letter C, no power to levy taxes or regulate trade. This, of course, does not surprise us, especially C. Because if you go all the way back to 1763, the Grenville duties, all the way until the Tea Act of 1773, this whole conflict, when it came down to it, revolved around the pragmatic issue, the practical issue of taxation. Sure, the colonials tended to argue from the position of principle. They invoked political philosophy, right, saying that the people are sovereign. But at bottom, the root of this conflict centered upon taxes. So, again, no surprise that the federal government, the first Constitution, has no power to levy taxes upon its citizens, nor does it have the power to regulate trade. And what does this mean? This basically means there's no national economy, which you could call an American national economy, right? Rather, you have, in a sense, 13 separate economies that aren't coordinated. Now, you can kind of foresee what problem is going to emerge from this, right? With no coordinated economic effort. But at this point in our development, the very beginning, the very inception of our nation, no power to regulate or to form interstate commerce, right? To form a national economy. So, what happens here is this, that yes, we are engaged in this war, which lasts until 1783. Well, officially it ends in 1783, but militarily it ends a little bit sooner. But, America is victorious, as we mentioned. And despite that, our country is in a state of instability. All right. In fact, this is a period of deep crisis, as stated here in the slide, a period of deep crisis. So, why is it a period of deep crisis? Well, it boils down to this, that, again, this is a country of United States, right? This country was on the verge of collapse due to the weakness, the inherent weakness of the Articles of Confederation. Okay, what are some examples of weaknesses? Well, for one, it lacked the power, of course, to tax. So therefore, how do you acquire revenue in order to subsidize various, projects and necessities of the country? You could not do that. Well, you could ask for contributions from states. Okay, but by the way, this brings in another weakness. Not only could you not tax, but when it came to individuals involved at the national level, at the federal level, most people put their state before the country. Okay, if you're from Virginia, for example, you're a Virginian first and an American second, right? You associate with the state. If you're a leader and a policymaker, you're more concerned about your state rather than the country at large. Okay, by the way, it seems more different today. It seems that, a lot of people tend to put their country first. I'm American first, and, a Californian second. Not everyone, of course, but many people do because of nationalism, all right, which we'll discuss later. Okay, so, well, to return to nationalism, there is no real nationalism around the Articles of Confederation. Nationalism, of course, is that feeling of unity among all people within this country, when in fact it's comprised of different people, right? How do you unite all these people when, in many ways they're more different than the same? And the way you do that is through nationalism. But there's no real nationalistic feeling at this time. So this is another, again, weaknesses, right? And other things like the inability to, or let's just say the leaders that were appointed or elected were basically unable or incapable of doing their job. They were inept in their performance. Again, they cared less about the country and more so with their state. And then you see various flare-ups of rebellion happen, and probably the so-called last straw of rebellion that happened that basically led to the end of the Articles of Confederation was something called Shays' Rebellion. And let me give you some background on what Shays' Rebellion was about. This occurred in Massachusetts, away from the seaboard, more in the western part, where, it's mostly populated by yeoman farmers, right? The average farmer, if not the more poorer farmers. Now, during this time, you also see an economic downturn, basically what we'd call a depression today. So these farmers who are already not very well off were also suffering due to the depression. And to make a long story short, they could not pay their debts. And this led creditors to the point of jailing them, if not seizing their property, right? Seizure of private property. Now, we know how that is sacred, private property that is, with the English and certainly with the Americans, right? Private property. So, because these creditors began to seize private property, and you couple that with some taxation efforts at the local level in order to raise revenue to help the economy that was ailing, you see this tax revolt called Shays' Rebellion. And it's called Shays Rebellion because it's led by this individual named Daniel Shay, who was actually an officer in the American Revolutionary War. So he's not a yeoman farmer, but he sympathized with the poor people, just like you had Bacon's Rebellion, where Nathaniel Bacon tended to sympathize with the poor people, even though he wasn't poor. Okay, so you had Shays Rebellion. And here's what happened. You have to put down rebellion, right? But at the local level, they didn't do this because the militia, the Massachusetts militias, sympathized with the poor farmers. So that didn't work. So what happened? They appealed to the national government, right? The federal government. And the federal government basically tried to raise an army, but they couldn't do it because they couldn't tax. Now, this was the last straw. Well, by the way, they were able to finally fund this private army, but nonetheless, Shays Rebellion was, again, the last straw. So what you had happening post Shays Rebellion is a critical mass of leaders who are very well connected, very influential. And again, we know a lot of these leaders like Madison, Benjamin Franklin, eventually Washington agrees. And what they did is meet in secret. You had 55 delegates meet in secret. Of course, it has to be secret because this could be easily interpreted as some kind of takeover in government, right? A coup, to use a more modern term. So they meet in secret in 1787 to discuss reforming the Articles of Confederation. And it's obvious to those in attendance, as well as many others who weren't actually in attendance. But here's the thing, there was this broad recognition that this Constitution called the Articles needed to be more centralized. In other words, you need to allow more power, delegate more power to this government if you want the country to survive. Now, let me also say this, that this whole period of colonial crisis going into the American Revolution, going into 1787, the world was watching in a way. The whole world was watching because it's the first experiment with republicanism, right? This first attempt to form a country not based on monarchical rule or an emperor system. Should the republic collapse, what would that signify to most? It would basically indicate that to them that, this idea of republicanism is a sham. After all, it doesn't work. You need to go with tradition, and tradition dictates that monarchy should rule. Now, we know that's not what happened because there's a constitution that was ratified 2 years later, and it's still our constitution today. So our country did not collapse. But let me underline this important point. During this whole period of crisis, between 81 and 86, or 87 actually, there was this agonizing feeling felt by most of our founders that this country might actually collapse. Okay, that our country was hanging in the balance, so to say, and something immediately and drastic had to happen. And this was exactly the secret convention in Philadelphia. Now, notice here, more contradiction, right? Is strengthening the government anti-revolutionary? Yes, because the conflict since Grenville Acts of 1763 was all about, this revolt against a central government trying to oppose its will and its authority over the colonies, right? So, again, more irony, more contradiction abounds here. The founders, let's be honest here, the founders are thinking more along pragmatic terms, just as the English Parliament was thinking in 1763 and 1765 with the Townshend Duties and the Grenville Acts. They need to do something quick because of this immediate concern, right? This is England, right? Of collapse due to, lack of, revenue. Well, here it's kind of similar. The circumstances. The founders need to do something quick because they feared that politically this system was built on stilts, so to say, and they needed to strengthen it. So what is to be done? Well, it was felt that they should strengthen the new government and come up with a constitution whose design is exactly that, to enlarge the power of the central government. Okay, so just to leave this video with more contradiction, and I just mentioned this, by this point in our national history, by 1787, you see these delegates meeting in secret, deciding what to do from a pragmatic standpoint, not one based on principles, so to say. This is a reversal of, let's say, the Stamp Act Congress or the local things like non-consumption agreements, right, where they were arguing based on principle. So again, it seems that there's a reversal here, right, and it's irony once again.